I gave them my savings, and I did it with my own hands. What would you do if the voice you trusted most didn't break into your life, but waited for you to invite it in? My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 61 years old, and until last spring, I believed I was careful enough to never become a cautionary tale. Not just financially careful, emotionally disciplined, rational, skeptical. The kind of man who double-checks links, ignores unknown numbers, and warns friends about scams at dinner tables. I was wrong. They said they were from my bank, and I believed them. The call came at 9:17 a.m. The number matched the one printed on the back of my debit card. Same area code, same prefix. That detail alone lowered my guard before I even answered. The man introduced himself with calm authority, not aggressive, not rushed, just composed. He knew my full name. He knew my address. He knew the last 4 digits of my social security number. He told me there was suspicious activity on my account. That phrase does something to your body. It bypasses analysis and lands straight in the chest. Suspicious activity, attempted transfers, possible breach. He said someone was trying to move funds from my retirement account. He said they had already blocked 2 attempts. He said time was critical. Time was critical. Within the first minute, I knew who hurt me, how it happened, and what was at stake. I just didn't realize I was the one cooperating. He told me my money needed to be secured, temporarily transferred into a protected holding account while they investigated. He said it was internal. He said it was routine. He said once the threat was neutralized, the funds would return within 24 hours. He stayed calm. That's what convinced me. Scammers in movies rush you. They threaten. They panic. This man did none of that. He reassured me. He even thanked me for being proactive. He said customers who respond quickly prevent loss. I wanted to be that customer. If this moment feels familiar, if you've ever felt that split-second fear when someone mentions your account, consider subscribing now. Stories like this are not just stories. They are mirrors. And sometimes warnings only work when they feel personal. I logged into my account while he stayed on the line. The balance was there, every dollar. The savings from overtime shifts. The money set aside after my divorce. The account that represented stability after rebuilding my life in my 50s. He guided me step by step. He told me not to hang up because a fraud attempt was still active. Disconnecting, he said, could allow the criminals to override their block. So I stayed. I read back verification codes. I confirmed the transfer. I moved everything, not because I was careless, but because I was trying to protect it. When the call ended, I felt unsettled, but oddly responsible. I had acted. I had prevented something worse. I even told myself I should thank the bank later for their vigilance. The next morning, I checked my account. 0, not pending, not processing, gone. There's a silence that enters a room when reality fractures. It doesn't scream. It drains. My eyes kept scanning the screen, as if the numbers might reappear if I blinked correctly. I called the official bank number from their website. No investigation. No protective transfer. No internal holding account. The woman on the line asked if I had authorized the transfer. My voice sounded foreign when I answered yes. That single word sealed it. She explained gently that I had been targeted by a spoofing scam. The number had been manipulated. The caller had engineered trust using publicly available data. The transfer was legitimate because I had authenticated myself. Legitimate. That word felt heavier than theft. No one forced me. No one hacked me. No one broke into anything. I opened the door. By the end of that second call, I knew exactly what had been lost. Not just money, not just retirement, but something quieter. The belief that I was still sharp enough to protect myself. And that loss would take much longer to calculate. The money was gone, but the humiliation arrived first. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the transaction history, like it was written in a language I used to understand. I refreshed the page again and again, as if repetition could reverse consequence. 61 years old, decades balancing spreadsheets, years teaching my own daughter to question everything online. And yet, I had transferred my entire retirement in under 40 minutes. The bank opened a case. They used words like investigation and recovery process, but their tone was careful, measured. I could hear the distance already forming. The transfer had been authenticated from my device. The security codes were entered correctly. There were no system breaches. Translation: I had authorized my own collapse. The first 24 hours felt unreal. I walked around my house touching objects as if they belonged to someone else. The sofa I paid off 10 years ago. The framed photo of my daughter at graduation. The small garden tools by the back door. Everything suddenly looked temporary. I didn't tell anyone that day. Shame isolates faster than fear. On the second day, the fraud department called back. They explained the money had been moved through multiple accounts within minutes. Layered transfers, international routing, crypto conversion. The technical explanation was impressive, precise, efficient, predatory. I asked the only question that mattered. Is there a chance I'll get it back? A pause, then percentages. Small ones. I thanked them for their help. I even said I understood. That's what men my age do. We pretend composure while something inside quietly fractures. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the loss itself, but because of the replay, the man's voice, the steady tone, the reassurance. I analyzed every sentence like evidence in a courtroom. He never threatened me. He never yelled. He simply guided me. That's what hurt most. I wasn't bullied. I was persuaded. By the third day, reality began to take shape in numbers. Mortgage still manageable. Utilities steady. But retirement? Gone. The cushion that meant I wouldn't have to depend on anyone? Erased. And dependency terrified me more than poverty. I had rebuilt my life once already after divorce in my 50s. I downsized. I saved aggressively. I worked freelance tax seasons to grow that account. That money wasn't just savings. It was proof that I had recovered. Now it felt like evidence that I hadn't. I considered telling my daughter. I drafted messages 3 times and deleted them. How do you admit you failed at the one thing you always preached about? Caution? Parents aren't supposed to become warnings. The 4th day, I drove to the bank branch in person. I needed a human face. I needed someone to look at me and say this was entirely my fault. The manager was kind, too kind. She explained how sophisticated these operations have become. Caller ID spoofing, data leaks, social engineering. Such a sterile term for emotional manipulation. She told me I was not alone, that many intelligent people fall victim. That criminals study psychology more than technology. I nodded, but none of it dissolved the weight pressing against my chest. Because intelligence wasn't the point. Trust was. When I returned home, the house felt quieter than usual. Not empty, just exposed, as if something invisible had passed through and rearranged my sense of safety. That's when the real loss began to surface. It wasn't the balance. It was the question that wouldn't leave. If I could be convinced once, could I be convinced again? And that thought frightened me more than the zero on the screen. By the end of the first week, the silence became heavier than the loss. I still hadn't told my daughter, not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't trust the version of myself she would see afterward. I had spent years being the steady one, the one who reads contracts carefully, the one who explains interest rates over dinner, the one who says, slow down, think before you act. Now I was the man who hadn't. I returned to work sooner than I had planned. I had been semi-retired, taking consulting projects when I felt like it. That flexibility was supposed to be a reward for decades of discipline. Instead, it became necessity. I called an old client and told him I was available full-time again. I framed it as wanting to stay active. He sounded impressed by my energy. He didn't hear the desperation beneath it. At night, the call replayed differently. Not the beginning, the middle, the moment my hesitation dissolved. There was a subtle shift in the caller's tone when I paused. He didn't pressure me. He reassured me. He said, Mr. Carter, I would never forgive myself if we allowed this breach to go through while you were on the line. He placed responsibility on himself, and that detail kept echoing. He didn't make me feel foolish. He made me feel protected. That's the architecture of trust. It doesn't knock down the door. It builds a bridge and invites you to walk across it. I started researching how these scams work. Spoofed numbers, data harvested from breaches, scripts tested and refined, psychological triggers mapped like formulas, urgency, authority, reassurance, isolation. Isolation was the one that struck me hardest. He had told me not to hang up, not to call the bank separately because it could interrupt the fraud monitoring. He framed staying on the line as protection. In reality, it prevented verification. He isolated me, and I cooperated. The more I understood mechanics, the more a strange anger began to surface. Not explosive anger, quiet, analytical anger. These operations were not random. They were structured, studied, optimized. Someone had studied men like me, men in their late 50s and early 60s, recently retired or rebuilding, independent, financially stable, slightly proud of their self-sufficiency, men who didn't want to admit vulnerability. That realization shifted something inside me, because the scam didn't just exploit fear, it exploited identity. I had always defined myself by competence, by rational decision-making, by control. The call wasn't just about money. It was about reinforcing that identity. You're acting responsibly. You're being proactive. I was protecting my image of myself while dismantling my future. 2 weeks later, the bank confirmed what I already suspected. The funds were unrecoverable. The case would remain open, but expectations were minimal. Minimal, another sterile word for final. I hung up and sat in my living room without turning on the lights. Dusk settled slowly, shadows stretching across the floor, like long unanswered questions. That was the first evening I allowed myself to feel something deeper than shame. Grief, not for the numbers, for the illusion that experience guarantees immunity. And somewhere in that quiet, another fear surfaced, one I hadn't articulated yet. If I told my daughter, would she see me differently? Would she start double-checking everything I said? Would she hesitate before trusting my advice? Would I quietly transition from guide to liability? That possibility hurt more than the financial loss, because money can be rebuilt. Authority, once fractured, doesn't always return the same way. And I wasn't sure which loss I was mourning more. 3 weeks passed before I told her, not because the situation improved, but because hiding it became heavier than the truth. We were sitting at her kitchen table. Sunday afternoon, coffee cooling between us. She was talking about refinancing her house, asking my opinion about interest rates. The irony pressed against my ribs. I heard myself giving advice, speaking calmly about long-term planning, liquidity, risk exposure. And suddenly I couldn't breathe, because I was advising her with a confidence I no longer felt entitled to. I interrupted her mid-sentence and said I needed to tell her something. My voice sounded steady, but my hands were cold. I explained the call, the spoofed number, the urgency, the transfer. I didn't dramatize it. I presented it like a case study. When I finished, there was a silence I couldn't read. She didn't look angry. She didn't look disappointed. She looked protective. That expression hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. Parents expect to protect. We don't expect to be assessed for vulnerability. She asked questions gently. How much? When? What did the bank say? I answered clinically. The number sounded smaller when spoken aloud than it felt in reality. Still, it was enough to alter the trajectory of my retirement entirely. Then she said something I didn't anticipate. Dad, this isn't about you being careless. These people are professionals. Professionals. The word landed differently than when the bank manager used it. For my daughter, it didn't sound technical. It sounded human. She wasn't analyzing the mechanics. She was reframing the narrative. But even then, something subtle shifted inside me. Later that week, she began calling more often, checking in, asking if I needed help reviewing emails, offering to sit with me when handling financial matters. It was done with love. I know that, but love can feel like supervision when pride is involved. I started second-guessing small decisions. A strange email? Delete it immediately. A missed call? Let it ring. I installed call blocking software. Changed passwords. Enabled two-factor authentication everywhere. And yet the anxiety didn't leave. It grew quieter but deeper. Because the real fracture wasn't technological, it was internal. At night, I would replay the moment of consent, the click, the confirmation, the irreversible submission of funds. I began noticing how often we act out urgency in daily life. Quick replies, immediate decisions, reflexive agreements. How many of those are shaped by fear rather than clarity? About a month after the loss, I stopped walking in my backyard garden. It sounds insignificant, but that garden was my ritual. Tomato plants along the fence, basil in small clay pots, a modest lemon tree I had nurtured for 3 years. I used to prune carefully, deliberately. Watching growth required patience, stability, time. After the scam, I avoided it because tending to something that grows slowly requires belief in the future. And for a while, I wasn't sure I trusted mine. The first metaphor arrived quietly there, among dry leaves and untrimmed branches. My savings had been like that garden, years of consistent care, small deposits, modest growth, no dramatic leaps, just disciplined nurturing. And in less than an hour, it had been uprooted, not by storm, not by disease, but because I handed someone the shovel. That realization didn't make me hate myself. It made me understand something uncomfortable. Security is not the absence of threat. It is the discipline of verification. And I had confused familiarity with safety. The voice sounded familiar. The number looked familiar. The procedure felt official. Familiarity isn't proof. That lesson came too late to protect my savings. But maybe not too late to protect something else. The question that began forming wasn't about recovery. It was about responsibility. If I stayed silent, what would that say about me? And if I spoke openly about it, who would I become next? A month and a half after the call, the anger finally arrived. Not loud, not explosive, precise. Up until then, everything had been shame, analysis, regret. I had dissected the scam like a spreadsheet, tracing every step, identifying every manipulation point. But anger requires a different kind of clarity. It requires acknowledging harm. Without internalizing all of it, I began reading case reports, interviews with fraud investigators, psychological breakdowns of social engineering. The language fascinated me. Authority bias, urgency trigger, scarcity framing, cognitive overload. They had used all of it. They didn't hack my account. They hacked my reflexes. That understanding shifted something inside me, because if they studied human behavior this carefully, then my reaction wasn't stupidity, it was predictability. And predictability can be exploited at any age. I went back to the garden one morning. The tomato plants were overgrown, leaning awkwardly against the fence. The lemon tree had small, stubborn fruit clinging to thin branches. I stood there longer than usual. I realized I had abandoned it not because I didn't care, but because nurturing something fragile felt risky after loss. That was the deeper wound. The scam didn't just take money. It injected doubt into routine, into habit, into confidence. I had started hesitating before basic transactions, before online purchases, before answering legitimate calls. Caution is healthy. Paralysis is not. I pruned the garden that morning carefully, slowly, removing dead growth, supporting weak stems with ties. It wasn't dramatic. It was maintenance. And it struck me that recovery might look the same way. Not dramatic redemption. Maintenance. 2 months after the loss, I received an official letter from the bank confirming the investigation had concluded. Funds unrecoverable. Case archived. Archived. A word that suggests order, closure, filing away. But nothing about it felt filed away. I held the letter longer than necessary. It represented the final acknowledgement that this chapter would not reverse itself. No sudden restitution. No surprise deposit. No cinematic justice. Just consequence. That evening, I sat with my daughter again. This time, I told her something different. I don't want you checking everything for me. She looked surprised. I explained that support was welcome. Supervision wasn't. I needed to rebuild competence, not surrender it. We agreed on boundaries, shared verification steps, clear protocols, not dependency. That conversation restored something subtle. dignity, because the danger after a scam isn't only financial, it's identity erosion. If I allowed myself to shrink into permanent caution, I would lose more than savings. I would lose agency. And agency at 61 matters more than comfort. I began speaking about it quietly with two friends. One admitted he had nearly fallen for a similar call months earlier. Another confessed he had lost money in a crypto scheme, but never told anyone. That's when I understood the final manipulation. Silence protects the scammer. Shame isolates the victim. And isolation prevents pattern recognition. The anger I felt was no longer just personal. It was structural. These operations thrive on pride, on the reluctance of men my age to admit vulnerability, on the assumption that experience equals immunity. Experience does not equal immunity. It only changes the shape of the trap. The garden began stabilizing again over the next weeks. New growth replacing cut branches. Small lemons turning yellow under steady sun. I watched them and realized something simple. Loss is not proof of incompetence. It is proof of exposure. And exposure, once acknowledged, can be fortified. But fortification requires something uncomfortable. Visibility. The question forming in my mind was no longer about the money. It was about whether I would remain quiet or whether I would risk being seen differently in order to prevent someone else from standing at their own kitchen table, staring at zero. 3 months after the call, the fear changed shape. It was no longer sharp. It was ambient, like a low electrical hum beneath ordinary life. I had rebuilt routines, strengthened digital safeguards, returned to steady consulting work. The external structure of my life looked stable again, but internally, something fundamental had shifted. Before the scam, I trusted my instincts. After it, I audited them. Every decision passed through a second filter. Every unfamiliar interaction triggered internal suspicion. A delayed invoice, investigate. A bank notification, cross-check. A new client inquiry, verify credentials twice. On the surface, that sounds wise. But wisdom and hypervigilance are not the same thing. There were evenings when I realized I had spent more mental energy scanning for threats than living. That realization unsettled me, because the theft had not only targeted my retirement, it had quietly attempted to occupy my future. That's when the deeper metaphor surfaced. The scam was not the storm. It was erosion. Storms are loud, immediate, obvious. Erosion is subtle. It reshapes foundations gradually. If you don't reinforce what was weakened, you don't notice the shift until structure begins to tilt. My confidence had eroded, not dramatically, incrementally. I found myself hesitating before offering financial advice, even when asked directly. I softened my opinions. I added disclaimers. But double-check that. You may want a second perspective. Don't just take my word. Caution is responsible, but I recognize the undertone. I no longer trusted my own authority. That was the quiet theft. One afternoon, while reviewing tax documents for a client, I noticed something important. My analytical skills hadn't diminished. My reasoning was intact. My pattern recognition was sharp. The mistake I had made wasn't intellectual. It was contextual. I had responded to urgency without independent verification. That distinction mattered because it meant my mind wasn't failing. My process had. So I rebuilt process. I created rules for myself, not emotional rules, procedural ones. No financial action taken during a live call. No verification through provided numbers. No urgency accepted without independent confirmation. Simple rules. Rules I should have followed before. But rules only matter when enforced without exception. I shared those rules with my daughter, with my friends, with anyone who would listen long enough. Not as a confession, as protocol, and something surprising happened. The more I spoke about it, the lighter it felt, not because the loss diminished, but because silence no longer carried it alone. A man at my gym overheard part of a conversation one morning and pulled me aside later. He admitted he had ignored a suspicious call recently because something in my story felt too familiar. He thanked me. That moment didn't restore my retirement, but it restored something else. Impact. The erosion began reversing there. Not fully, not instantly, but measurably, because confidence rebuilt through action feels different than confidence assumed. 6 months after the scam, I stood in my garden again, holding a fully ripened lemon. The tree had survived neglect. It had adjusted. It had continued producing despite uneven care. Resilience isn't dramatic. It's consistent. And I realized something that surprised me. The man who transferred that money in panic is not the same man standing here now. Not because I'm wiser in theory, but because I've accepted vulnerability without surrendering identity. That acceptance changes posture, and posture changes presence. The money is still gone, but I am not. The strangest part of loss is not the moment it happens. It's the quiet recalibration afterward. 7 months passed. The routines were stable. The consulting income steady. I had adjusted projections, extended timelines, recalculated retirement expectations. On paper, the damage was contained, manageable, but internally, something had reorganized. Before the scam, I measured security in numbers. After it, I began measuring it in awareness. There's a difference. Numbers create the illusion of permanence. Awareness accepts fragility and builds around it. That shift did not make me paranoid. It made me deliberate. I started volunteering twice a month at a small community center, speaking to men and women in their 50s and 60s about financial safeguards, not as an expert, not as a warning sign, as someone who made a mistake publicly. The first time I shared the full story, my throat tightened halfway through, not because I felt exposed, but because I realized how universal reactions were in the room. Heads nodding, eyes narrowing in recognition. People leaning forward when I described a spoofed number matching my debit card. They weren't judging me. They were seeing themselves. After one session, a woman approached me and said she had nearly transferred funds the previous month under similar pressure. She stopped only because she felt rushed. She said hearing my breakdown of urgency made her understand why that feeling mattered. That comment stayed with me because urgency was a fracture point. The scam worked because it compressed time. It forced decision before reflection. It framed hesitation as danger. But hesitation is not weakness. It is protection. That realization became the core of every conversation I had afterward. Pause. Verify. Disconnect. 3 simple words that might have saved me. The garden became symbolic in a way I hadn't planned. Growth requires patience. Protection requires boundaries. Pruning requires removal of what threatens stability. You cannot rush fruit into ripening. You cannot demand growth without time. Why, then, did I allow urgency to override that principle in something far more valuable? Because fear narrows perspective, and fear was expertly engineered. I no longer replay the call at night. That surprised me the most. For months, it was a loop. Tone, words, my confirmation, the click, the transfer. Now, when I think of it, I don't feel the same constriction in my chest. I feel clarity. The man on the phone was skilled, but so am I. The difference is intention. He used understanding to extract. I now use it to fortify. There is still a gap in my retirement account, a measurable loss, a delayed comfort I once expected. But there is also something that wasn't there before, intentional vigilance, and perhaps more importantly, humility without collapse. I am not immune to manipulation, but I am not defined by it either. The lemon tree continues producing fruit, not because it was never shaken, but because its roots remain intact. And so did mine. 8 months later, the numbers still don't look the way they used to. The retirement projection is leaner, the timeline longer, the margin smaller. But something else looks different too. Me. When I think about that morning now, I no longer see a foolish man. I see a man who responded to fear without protocol, a man who confused familiarity with legitimacy, a man who believed urgency meant danger instead of manipulation. And that distinction matters, because if I label myself careless, I shrink. If I label the experience instructive, I grow. The money is gone. That part is permanent, but the meaning of it is not. I used to believe financial security was the ultimate shield. If the account was strong, life was stable. Now I understand something more layered. Security is not a number. It is a system, a mindset, a refusal to let pressure override verification. I rebuilt my system. No action without independent confirmation. No trust based solely on tone. No urgency accepted as proof. Simple rules. But discipline is not measured by how well you perform when calm. It is measured by how well you pause when afraid. That is what I lacked that morning. And that is what I will never lack again. There are still moments when I wish I could rewind. When I imagine what that balance would look like now. The travel I postponed. The comfort I anticipated. The flexibility I surrendered. But regret is unproductive if it becomes identity. I refuse to let 1 hour define 61 years. If you've listened this far, I want you to understand something clearly. Intelligence does not immunize you. Experience does not shield you. Pride does not protect you. Protocol does. If this story stayed with you, not as entertainment, but as recognition, consider subscribing, not for sympathy, not for drama, but because conversations like this keep people from standing alone in their kitchens, staring at a zero that used to represent safety. Silence helps the wrong side. Awareness strengthens the right one. I still walk through my garden every morning. I prune slowly. I water deliberately. I inspect the soil before assuming it's healthy. Growth, I've learned, requires attention, not assumption. And so does security. The question I leave you with isn't about money. It's about pause. If you were me, 61 years old, hearing that your savings were under attack, would you have hesitated long enough to verify? Or would urgency have convinced you to? Sometimes survival isn't about fighting harder. It's about slowing down and choosing not to open the door